Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. So today we're going to be training on 2765 data reporting for 2765 designated facilities. My name is Haley Klingel, and I'm the provider training specialist for the 2765 team at BHA. We'll go ahead and get started. So on our agenda today, we'll start with the statute and rule updates that relate to the changes to 2765 data reporting. After that, we'll review data reporting requirements and review the template step-by-step that BHA created for 2765 designated providers. Then lastly, we'll go over how to submit completed data reports to BHA. So where are the updates to data reporting coming from for 2765 designated facilities? These changes are referenced in Chapter 11, Section 11.5 of Rule. This section of rule states that each designated facility for 2765 services by the BHA, pursuant to Article 65 of Title 27, Colorado Revised Statute, shall file an annual report with the BHA. The report shall be submitted in the format and timeframe required by the BHA. This data shall include individuals on emergency mental health holds and/or individuals on short-term or long-term certifications that are being treated in placement facilities under the auspices of the 2765 designated facility. Today, we're not going to review each of the requirements laid out in this section of rule, but they can be found in section 11.5, and I do encourage providers to review that section of rule to help familiarize yourself with the data requirements, especially if you will not be utilizing the template that BHA is providing. Next, we're going to be reviewing BHA's data reporting template. BHA has created a data reporting template for 2765 designated facilities to use in accordance with required disaggregate data reporting. This data reporting template can only be used in either a Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel format. Facilities can use an alternative method, for example, if they'd like to pull from their EHR, to collect and report this data as long as they're able to meet all data reporting requirements as identified within the reporting template. One thing that's important to note is that the facility still must be able to submit the data in an Excel document format, specifically in the format of an XLSM document. Other formats of data submission when not using the BHA's template will not be accepted. Next in the training, we're going to review each of the tabs of the data reporting template for 2765 providers. The first tab is the data instructions. So these instructions can be used essentially as a reference for each of the separate reporting tabs. In the instructions, it will show you each required data point and also give examples for what the section should look like for certain tabs. The next tab is facility information. So in this tab, you'll enter each designated location. If your facility has multiple facilities with different designations, make sure you're only listing the facilities that have an active 2765 designation. If a facility has more than one license type or endorsement, you'll select all that apply to that location. So looking at the columns in column A, you'll enter the facility name. In column B, you'll enter the county where it's located. And then lastly, in column C, you'll select the facility type or types. The next area we'll review is demographic information. So in every tab, you'll need to report the demographic information of clients for all involuntary and voluntary service types. This will be the same process on each of the separate tabs. First, you'll manually enter the client's name or Medicaid ID, and then date of birth in column A and B. In column C, you'll use the drop-down to select identified gender. If this information is unknown, you'll enter a 0 or select the unknown option for any of the sections for demographics. In column D and E, you'll use the drop-down to select race and ethnicity. And then lastly, in column F, you'll manually enter the county where that individual resides. If the client is unhoused, you can enter either unknown or unhoused in that column. The next tab is for voluntary individuals. In this section, you'll record the demographic information of clients who receive services on a voluntary basis, including individuals who may have originally been on an emergency mental health hold prior to electing to receive services on a voluntary basis. On the bottom of this slide is an example of what this tab should look like. The next tab is Emergency Mental Health, or M1 holds. In this section, you'll record data for individuals that are placed on an emergency mental health hold at your facility and individuals who are received at your facility on an emergency mental health hold, including transfers. On the bottom of this slide is an example of what this tab should look like. On the next slide, we'll review each of the columns excluding the demographic information. So after you enter the demographic information, you'll then use the drop-down in column G to select who implemented the M1 hold. This can only be an intervening professional, law enforcement, or an M7, which is an order from the court for evaluation and treatment. Next, in column H, you'll use the drop-down to select the credentials of the intervening professional if the M1 was initiated by an intervening professional. If it was initiated by law enforcement or court order, you just select the NA option. In column I, you'll use the drop-down to select what criteria that individual met for the hold to be placed, so whether that individual was danger to self, others, gravely disabled, or a combination of any of those three. And lastly, in column J, you'll use the drop-down to select how the hold was resolved. The next tab is for transportation holds. So in this section, you'll record data for individuals that are received at your facility on a transportation hold. On the bottom of this slide is an example of what this tab should look like. And on the next slide, we'll review each of the columns excluding the demographic information. After you enter the demographic information, you'll use the drop-down menu to select who implemented the transportation hold, whether it was EMS or law enforcement. In column H, you will then use the drop-down to select if restraint was used to detain and transport the individual. And then lastly, in column I, you'll use the drop-down to select what the outcome of the hold was once the individual was transported. The next tab is for certifications. In this section, you'll record data for individuals that are currently on involuntary certifications on December 31st of 2024 and on. All other individuals terminated from certifications will be collected through the Terminating Certifications portal on BHA's website. On the bottom of this slide is an example of what this tab should look like. And on the next slide, once again, we'll review the columns, excluding demographic information. After you've entered the demographic information, you'll use the drop-down to select the certification type. In column H, you'll use the drop-down to select the service type and whether the certification was on an inpatient or outpatient basis. And then in column I, you'll use the drop-down to select how the certification was initiated, whether it is by a professional person or the ITP to STC route. In column J, you'll use the drop-down to select what criteria the individual is meeting for certification. And then lastly, in column K, you'll use the drop-down to select what services were provided during the certification. You should select all that apply, and you can select multiple with the drop-down in this column. The next tab is for involuntary medications. So in this section, you'll record data for all involuntary medications, including emergency medications and court-ordered medications. Multiple medication types can be selected, and the total number should include administration of any emergency or court-ordered medication. If an individual has both, you will group these together. On the bottom of this slide is an example of what this tab should look like. On the next slide, we'll also review all of the columns excluding the demographic information section. So in column F, you'll use the drop-down to select the type of involuntary medication, whether emergency or court-ordered. If there was both, please select both. In column G, you'll use the drop-down to select medication type, and similar to the previous column, you'll select all that apply if there are multiple medications. In column H, you'll manually enter the total number of administrations for emergency medication. If emergency medications were not administered, you'll enter 0 here. In column I, you'll manually enter the total number of court-ordered medications, not administrations of court-ordered medications. If there were no court-ordered medications, you'll enter 0 in this column. The next tab is for emergency interventions. So in this section, you'll record data for all seclusion and restraint episodes. Each individual must have each emergency intervention episode reported. If an individual has multiple episodes or events, please group these together by the individual. The demographic information for that individual will then be left blank on the additional episodes to indicate the entry is for the individual above. On the bottom of this slide is an example of what this tab should look like, as well as an example for an individual who has multiple seclusion and/or restraint episodes. On the next slide, we'll review each of the columns, excluding the demographic information section again. In column F, you'll use the drop-down to select the intervention type, so whether it was seclusion, restraint, or both. In column G, you'll use the drop-down to select what type of restraint was used, and if you are documenting a restraint episode. If you are documenting seclusion only, you'll leave this area blank. Lastly, in column H, you'll manually enter the length of the episode in the hours to minute format listed on the slide. The next tab is for electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. In this section, you'll want to record data for individuals receiving ECT, including both voluntary and court-ordered ECT. After you enter the demographic data, you'll use the drop-down in column F to select if the treatment was voluntary or court-ordered. Then in column G, you'll manually enter the total number of ECT treatments that individual received. At the bottom of the slide is an example of what a data entry for this section should look like. The next tab is imposition of a legal disability. In this section, you'll record data for the imposition of legal disability or deprivation of any legal rights, which is the M23 and M24 process. If you do not have any of these, this section can then be left blank. After entering demographic data information, you'll then manually enter the specific right that was deprived in column F. This does have to be identical to what appears in the court order, which is the M24. At the bottom of the slides is an example of what a data entry for this section should look like. The last tab on the template is for feeding tubes. So in this section, you'll record data for both voluntary and involuntary events. If both voluntary and involuntary administration occurs for a client, you will utilize 2 lines following the same example as seclusion and restraints. At the bottom of the slide is an example of what a data entry for this section should look like. The next section that we'll talk about is submitting data reports. Completed data reports must be submitted by July 1st of 2025, and all data reports do have to be sent encrypted. Data reports must be submitted to the email listed below. Another thing to note is that each designated facility will submit 1 data report per agency, not per site. Additionally, 2765 data must be sent either through encryption or password protected services due to the nature of data being client level and not aggregated to the facility level any longer. If your facility is unable to meet encryption standard, it is recommended that 2765 data be submitted to this email via a password protected file. You must password protect your data submission workbook before submitting it to BHA. The data submission and the password must be sent in separate emails to BHA as well. If your facility does not have encryption, password protective services, or a secure file transfer platform, you will need to request an encrypted email from CDHS Data Services at the email listed below. I've also attached Colorado email encryption guidelines here if you would like to reference that. We do have additional tips for providers that we would like to review. The first is that BHA is recommending providers to submit data on either a monthly or quarterly basis for future data years to alleviate some of the administrative burden of this new collection requirement. Additionally, if you are wanting more information on how to use the template, you can always refer to the data instructions, which are on the first tab of the template. As I've said before, data is due July 1st of 2025. And then lastly, if you do have questions or concerns, please make sure to reach out to us via email. This will essentially allow us to advocate for better data collection processes and tools to hopefully make this process more seamless and less burdensome in the future. Lastly, we do have additional resources surrounding the new data process. So the 2765 team is offering office hours to help answer questions regarding data reporting requirements. Office hours can be found on the BHA calendar or at the link listed below. And questions can also be directed either to my email directly or Jessica Bell, which her email is listed on the slide as well. That is the end of the presentation. If you are looking for more resources, make sure to check out our website, which is linked on this slide. Thank you.